afternoon. I'm Melissa Ridgen. It's somewhat surprisingly messy and certainly contentious. There's always been a misunderstanding of what is or isn't Métis. The word has been used to identify a nation, a people, but it's also been used more loosely and is a French word for anyone who is of any mixed blood. In recent years, it's being used more and more with people claiming that they are Métis and as such are entitled to our rights. So today we are putting Matey Identity in focus, and we want you to join in the conversation. Here's our phone lines. They're open. Call us toll-free, 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. Before I introduce my guests to you, let's set the scene with a look at APTN's Investigates documentary by our own Todd Lamarand called Identity Crisis, which aired in November 2016.
It's who we are. It's natural. It's in our DNA. It's just things we do. Even as a child, it's just like our humor, our gathering, our social identity.
Haney lives in the Métis community of St. Lazare, a stone's throw from the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border.
We thrived. We're a big Métis community before even anybody came here. People got to understand that Métis is more than Aboriginal ancestry with European blood. It's history. It's the grassroots things. It's all that combined.
Haney believes there is only one true Métis who come from Western Canada.
But in all reality, though, the majority of the Métis people, they're in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta.
In Atlantic Canada, there are many who would say, no way.
I'm not First Nations, I'm not Inuit, so I'm Métis, I'm of mixed blood.
This is kind of, I think, a very important representation of Métis history, Métis culture. It's something like substantial.
Adam Gaudry is a self-described Red River nationalist.
It's important that Métis remain in charge of determining who is Métis.
And believes the term Métis is too widely used, especially when it comes to self-identification.
Like I said, there could have been mixed communities elsewhere, absolutely, but they didn't have the same kind of nationalistic understanding of the Métis Nation, and they didn't call themselves Métis, so why are we calling them Métis?
Dubé rejects the suggestion she's not Métis, and rejects being called a non-status Indian.
And for me, a non-status doesn't exist. It's like a very gray area. Either you're First Nations, you're Métis, or you're Inuit, or you're nothing at all.
Garnet Purdy and his pals are getting ready for a clam bake.
The word Métis, I guess we've just used that probably for the last 20 years. This is where our families have lived on these Tuskegee Islands for the last 275 years.
He says they're a mixture of English, Scottish, and First Nation.
We were always comfortable with half-bloods or half-breeds.
But that's not what they call themselves anymore.
We use that strictly now. I don't think you'll find anybody calling themselves a half-breed. They'll just use the word Métis. We're comfortable with it, and like I said, other people understand exactly what we're trying to say, who we are.
If one considers the word Métis as a marketing brand, it's been relatively successful.
A lot of the time, the Métis Nation is the standard in which these groups are trying to meet. And so using our terminology, which is now enshrined in law, they're aspiring to kind of become Métis on the scale that the Métis Nation is, and even though there's not the history for it.
Well, first off, let me assure you that we have been lambasted by the traditional Western media for this and by Eastern media, Métis, for this but for very different reasons that they don't want to engage in this discussion. Unless it's online or under 140 characters or less, and often behind fake names. So everybody wants to be Métis, but no one wants to discuss how being Métis is, or how it's determined, what makes Métis Métis. And if you want to hash it out, well, the Twitter trolls will come from you on either side. Tanya Dubé, who we saw a clip from earlier in that, she represents the Canadian Métis Council based in New Brunswick. She was invited to join us on our show, but in a press release today, she said that they would have to decline. The organization felt that the issue wouldn't get the attention that it deserves because Winnipeg is having a civic election today. And they also felt that a few days wasn't enough for them to prepare for the show. We will be hearing from people later in the show who had less than a few days to discuss the topic, but were able to offer their thoughts nonetheless. And in the business of news, we often hit up people within minutes of needing a comment for their perspective, just to be clear. The Métis National Council also wouldn't return requests to come onto this show to discuss the issue of Métis identities. So, joining us though, we have a controversial figure kind of in the middle of this Métis debate. His name is Daryl LaRue. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Social Justice and Community Studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax. In recent years, he's begun to research this phenomenon of Eastern Métis groups in Quebec and the Maritimes. He's researched and written extensively on the subject, including white settler revisionism and the making of Métis everywhere, the evocation of the Métissage in Quebec and Nova Scotia, and a paper called Self-Made Métis that appeared in Maisonneuve. We also have joining us via Skype, Jason Madden. Where's Jason's here? He is a Métis lawyer who worked on much of the litigation and advanced on Métis rights and claims from Ontario westward over the past 15 years. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Melissa.
Did you get any grief about coming to have this chat?
I didn't mention I was on your show.
They just directed it this way, which is fine, Okay, well, let's just start, I guess, then because we've got people saying, we're Métis, and then you've got other Métis saying, that doesn't fit the definition of Métis. You aren't even Indigenous. You over there are Indigenous of some sort, but it's not Métis. You maybe are something and something else, but you're not Métis. Let's go to, and all of this has popped up in fairly recent time, right? Mm-hmm. Let's go right to what might be part of the problem, the 2016 Daniels decision. In the Supreme Court, it says there is no one exclusive Métis people in Canada any more than there is no one exclusive Indian people in Canada. The Métis of Eastern Canada and Northern Canada are as distinct from Red River Métis as any two people can be. Is this, and it goes on, but is this, do you guys think, the foundation of where we're getting the confusion over who is or isn't Métis? I'll let you go first.
Okay, I mean, I think that some of this social movement, I'm calling it a social movement, the Eastern Métis movement, definitely comes before Daniels. So I have generally identified it in relation to the Marshall decision, which was a decision in 1999 of the Supreme Court that decided that the Mi'kmaq had a right to make a moderate livelihood from the fishery. So in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, you see that Acadians start calling themselves Métis to access Aboriginal rights after Marshall, and actually as the court case is happening. So it's a movement that sort of predates what happens in Quebec by about 5 years in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and then it grows even more after Pauli. So there's the Pauli decision in 2003 where the Supreme Court again more or less decided that the Métis have Aboriginal rights under the Constitution, and also actually set up a test, a 10-point test in terms of Métis identity. After that, you see that the numbers grow significantly in Quebec and continue to grow at a really rapid pace in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia.
Well, I just read, according to census data, just to put this in perspective for our audience who may not know some of the backstory to this, from 2006 till 2016, the number of people who identify as Métis in Nova Scotia alone increased 125%.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in Nova Scotia,
10 years.
Yeah, in 1996, there were 830 people who are identifying as Métis, many of them using the term to mean mixed race, not as a distinct Métis people. And then in 2016, there's over 23,000. So it went up 28 times in 20 years. Right?
Jason, what are your thoughts on this relatively new phenomenon of people claiming Métis identity in Eastern Canada?
I think it's a unique element of the kind of experiment getting out of the lab from the Pauli case. The challenge for the Métis nation historically has been government has not been willing to negotiate. So the Métis nation turned to the courts to say, let's establish we have rights, establish we have claims. Now people from other locations are using those cases in order to, create Métis anew in areas where historic communities never were. They are not a part of the Métis nation. And it really speaks to the same problem that First Nations have when the federal government starts to get into defining who an Indian is under the Indian Act. We now have the courts playing And it's a double-edged sword. In one way, they're validating rights. In another way, they're creating these constructs that are not based upon a peoplehood analysis. They're based upon the facts the courts have before them in a specific situation. And you're not getting a principle-based approach. Now, and to a certain extent, you have this phenomenon happening. But the other thing, too, is it sucks the oxygen out of the room to really talk about the Métis Nation. There is no identity crisis in the Métis Nation. These groups have been for over 200 years been asserting themselves as the Métis Nation, using that term. They're the only ones that actually meet the criteria for peoplehood, a language, a culture, a collective consciousness. You know, their collective consciousness doesn't rise 20 minutes after the Pauli comes down. And so I think that what you're seeing happening, and it is chickens coming home to roost to a certain extent. Governments didn't do their job and sit down and negotiate with the Métis Nation back in 1982. We've taken a series of cases to the Supreme Court of Canada, and now we have some of the residual mess that is created by the court not being able to do this in a principled way, only being able to do it based upon the facts before you. Where the Métis Nation has always been focused on this, though, is those court cases were a reason to get to the table, to get to negotiating tables to finally negotiate these issues. As I said, the Métis Nation doesn't have an identity crisis. We know what communities are a part of us. We know who we are. We have for 2 centuries. The issue is now you have these other groups who read a court case and say, hey, that's neat, maybe I'll fit into there. And they have none of the antecedents of peoplehood. And it's embarrassing to a certain extent for those of us who have been involved in the court cases, because where this has turned now is unbelievable when you see how people are contorting what these court cases have said about validating Métis rights based upon people being distinct from Indians, being distinct from First Nations and Inuit, and trying to use this as essentially just any mixed blood person being able to claim their Métis. And it really is quite disempowering to the Métis Nation. And it is really quite a mess that the courts have made, not simply because these issues haven't been dealt with in the way they should be dealt with, nation to nation, government to government, with negotiations with the appropriate representative. We now have those people established, and hopefully that will further solidify who the Métis are, the Métis Nation. But I think that this phenomenon isn't going away anytime soon, and I think it's good to expose it, what it is. Why
would these groups, there would have been room for these groups to pop up and say, we have the same rights, but as non-status Indians? There was room for them to come in there. Why did you think they're using Métis? Big M, capital Métis.
Well, because they see it as, and you, I think on the video before, you see it as this, well, I don't fit in here, I don't fit in here, I have an ever so great Indian grandmama, therefore I must be Métis.
Well,
that is so offensive to the Métis Nation.
Yeah.
And that is not who are a people. Now, let's just get this straight. Why Indigenous people have rights is they were here first. They were here prior to Canada becoming Canada, Manitoba becoming Manitoba, jurisdictions becoming jurisdictions. And that is what grounds their right. And they were here first, and they were a distinct people. And only the Métis Nation has those antecedents of peoplehood. And so the issue that you have is these people who, clearly don't want to be a part of their Anishinaabe relatives and want to create some groups anew. And it really does, it's colonization freedom that you have ongoing of these, largely non-Indigenous settlers are now reprofiling themselves as Indigenous to access Aboriginal rights. Offensive to Indigenous, offensive to, and it is just common law.
Sorry, you're cutting out there, Jason. Earlier this week, so the whole notion of what is Métis, we put this to our viewers, our followers on social media earlier this week, and we asked, what do you think about the issue of Métis identity? Is any Métis person a First Nation, or is any Métis a person with a First Nation ancestor? We asked that. 66% said yes, and 34% said no. That's 66% of people polled say they believe if you have any Indigenous ancestor, you are Métis. So that shocked me and ruffled some feathers of Métis people who took issue with the question, not only with the question, but the response that it gathered. And I guess we're seeing a little bit of that here. If I have an ancestor 5 generations back who is Mi'kmaq or Algonquin, then I am present-day Métis. We gave people a few multiple choice answers, or a few multiple choices too. In another poll online, this is on our social media, that asked, who is Métis? 5% said anybody who has mixed blood. 79% said a person who's Métis has Métis parents, or at least one Métis parent. 16% said an Indigenous ancestor somewhere in your background makes you Métis. And 0% said that if you're married to an Indigenous person, you're Métis. I was happy to see that one was at 0. I was surprised to see some of the results in some of the other categories, though. Okay, so later in the show, we are going to get into the word Métis, the semantics of it. What type of noun is it? Should we be using small m Métis to describe some people, big M Métis to describe others? Are there non-status people misidentifying themselves as Métis? Should a new word be created for this Indigenous group of people who seem to distinguish, or the Métis distinguish as separate from themselves? But if your ancestry, it has just one Aboriginal person in it back in the 400 years ago, are you Indigenous at all? So we are going to take a break. We will be back with more to discuss Métis identity. Stay with us. Conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, and send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca.
Just where do many of these Métis in the Maritimes come from? We start in a place called the Village Historique Acadian. In 1604, 79 Frenchmen established a colony in what is today New Brunswick.
Since they didn't knew how winter was hard here in Canada, they suffered greatly there, and half of the men died on that island and were buried there.
Families didn't start arriving until the 1630s and 40s.
Not everywhere, but some of them did marry between the two cultures. We don't have a Métis culture or Métis. That name or that signification is not here like it's out west.
Gregory Burke and his supporters disagree. They say the Acadian Matey began soon after colonization.
They didn't have any wives, and they married the Mi'kmaq wives. What come out of that were the children of mixed breed, the half-breeds.
Burke says that having one Mi'kmaq ancestor from that era is enough to make a person Indigenous today.
I mean, I always identified that I was Indian, and I only have one ancestor. So who has the right to say I'm not Indian? It's for our ancestors that had to suffer the genocide. It's for our ancestors that for hundreds of years they weren't recognized as the Indigenous people. And it's time that we do be recognized as Indigenous people.
That was another clip from Todd Lamoran's documentary Identity Crisis, which aired on APTN Investigates in 2016. Let's go to social media right now. We want to hear what you are saying about this topic. Catherine Guillaume, Métis is a French word meaning mixed Indian and European blood. It's crazy. I'm white. My husband is First Nations, Cree. My daughter should be Métis, but according to the government, she's not Métis. She's First Nations. She is First Nations. Let's see what Kelly had to say. My mom is Anishinaabe, and my dad is English-Swedish, and the amount of times people are telling me that I'm Métis are countless. That is a misconception that most people have. Thanks for that, Kellyanne. And now we go to Chloe. Métis would really define one parent being non-Indigenous, not a grandparent, not a great-grandparent, etc. Sorry, guys, otherwise we will have more princess white ducks claiming their full-blood Métis status. And we go to Jennifer. If it isn't legally, then those of us of mixed ancestry should have some sort of designation as well. Why would mixed ancestry have been recognized hundreds of years ago, but not today? Robin. The Métis Nation is not a pan-Indigenous catch-all for mixed nations. You're related to the Michif language, ancestors, culture, and traditions if you're not. And we go to Barbara. Not from an Indigenous perspective, you aren't. Not from a Métis Nation perspective, you aren't. From a colonial perspective, some may believe, she's got the quotes, so still belief doesn't make it real. And Ryan, if you do not trace your family back to a Métis community, do not involve yourself in Métis culture or try to perpetuate our ways, why would you even want to claim Métis status and heritage? So that's all we have. So if you would like to add your opinion to this, of course you can. Here's how. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Chief Terrence Paul of the Member 2 First Nation on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, is co-chair of the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs there. Weeks ago, his group and the Métis National Council drew a line in the sand by signing a memorandum of understanding that essentially jointly dismisses claims that Métis exist in that province as a nation. He joined me earlier today from Nova Scotia. Here's what he had to say. Hi, Chief Paul. So you've spent most of your life in Member 2. You've been Chief of Member 2 First Nation for 35 years. When did the Acadian Matey come on your radar? Is this something you knew of Métis people in Nova Scotia growing up?
No. There's first I've heard of Acadian Matey. There's only Mi'kmaq here in Nova Scotia.
So when you've heard of Métis, it was people who are from somewhere else, not Nova Scotia.
Yes, they do. They have their own defined territory, the Métis that, and we've met with them, and they explained fully and fairly well who they are and where their territory is.
When did you first hear the term Acadian Métis? When did that first come onto your radar?
Well, we got feedback from the provincial government that there was people claiming Métis status, and that they had cards that indicated that. So they expected to get the same rights as the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, which is not right, and that's not the case.
And when did this happen? When did you first hear from the province that there were people claiming Métis status and all of the rights that come with Section 35?
I'm saying about in the last couple of years.
So, because people have said this is a quote unquote new phenomenon, and you're saying when you grew up, you'd never heard of Métis out in Cape Breton around Member 2 in Nova Scotia, and then just a few years ago, they came on the radar. So when did you and the Métis National Council get together on this issue?
We got together in October, early October. We've been having discussions before that, and we finally agreed that we would meet with the president here in Nova Scotia, and it was a very good meeting, and as a result, we developed an MOU to work together to ensure that the people that claim Métis status are actually Métis, and the Métis know themselves who they are. And they have a process that it's a rigorous process that they go through in order for somebody to be recognized as a Métis. Mm-hmm. And we have the same process here, And the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia are the only ones that can define for themselves who is Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. So that's our process.
And so what is the harm in people saying, look, we've done our genealogy, we've found that we have an ancestor who's Mi'kmaq, and we expect some rights. You can't just look and say, let these organizations take shape and make a challenge themselves and let the courts decide?
As I said, I believe that the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia are the only ones that can define for themselves who is Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia.
And the Métis are saying the same thing. And okay, so what about if, what's been the blowback, I guess, or has there been any blowback since you and the MNC signed this MOU?
Sure, like we got feedback from the organizations that they don't agree with what we're saying and what we're doing, and that's their it was just their prerogative. But we still maintain that the Mi'kmaq are the only right holders here in Nova Scotia.
Okay, well, thank you for taking the time to share that with us. We really appreciate it as we're having this discussion here on InFocus today. Thanks so much, Chief Paul.
You're welcome.
I am still here in studio with Daryl LaRue, who has done extensive research into what some call a phenomenon of Quebec and Métis. And joining us now via Skype is Greg Burke of the Atlantic Aboriginal Nation, who has long asserted that Métis do in fact exist in the Maritimes and in fact predate the Red River Métis. He's joining us now. Greg, I'm going to start with you. I'm not sure if you could hear from your end what Chief Paul had just said, but I'm going to quote something. You used to be with the Bras-d'Or Métis, and I found this on their website. And I'm going to quote it to you and have you respond to it. Our Métis ancestors are the founding nation that forged the very foundation of the fur industry that catapulted the fur industry across this country from coast to coast, sharing their skills, tools, and knowledge of trapping and hunting to the western provinces as we know them today. So, you know, in Manitoba, the territorial acknowledgements, we recognize this is the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, the Dene people, and this is also acknowledged as the homeland of the Métis Nation. You guys would argue that's not the case. The homeland of the Métis Nation would be the Maritimes.
No. The Western Métis have a homeland in the west, as we do here in the east. So there's nothing that I'm defining as we are the homeland of the Métis, because the Western Métis have their culture, which is very similar to ours, and we have ours. So I would define the homeland actually for the Métis of all of Canada, and that's how Louis Riel had seen it. That's how Gabriel Dumont had seen it, and that's how the Métis Federation of Canada sees it. And that is what has pole vaulted the MFC to organize the Métis from coast to coast to coast, because we're scattered. And the Métis, being the true nomads, claim that all of Canada is our homeland, because our homeland came from the French marrying the Abenaki, Wapano, Mi'kmaq, Cree, Crow, Blackfoot, and that's all through. So you don't, if you read history, you don't see Mi'kmaq marrying Cree or Crow or Blackfoot. What you see is the French, the Scottish, and German, whatever, traveling right across Canada, marrying the Métis, and we have Métis not only all across Canada from coast to coast to coast, but all in through the States. We have Métis, our ancestors are here in Louisiana, and they carry on the culture in Louisiana. Well, they have no contact with the Métis in the West, and they have no contact or very little contact with the Métis in the East, but they carry on the culture.
Okay, well, so there's, as Chief Terrence Paul and the
it's a shame to
MNC
see and
have
to hear
say
this kind of disgruntled coming from the Western Métis where really
it's not just from the Western Métis. It's from the Indigenous people right in your own province, the Mi'kmaq. I wanted to have your response to the MOU that was signed by the Métis National Council and by the Mi'kmaq chiefs of Nova Scotia, who they've just put out an MOU saying the Métis are not around here. You know, we talked to Chief Paul, who he's 35 years as chief at Member 2. He's born and raised in Nova Scotia. He's never, until recent years, he said, you just heard him say it too, until recent years, heard that there was any Métis people, as a people, settled in Nova Scotia.
Yeah. Well, sorry, did you have another question to that? Or?
No, I'm just wondering, so he's saying that you don't exist there. And the MNC is saying that too. So and you're saying you do. So I want to hear your response to their position.
That's his prerogative. You know, that's his prerogative. I mean, he lived on a reserve for 35 years, as he said, and of course the Métis lived right across Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and all through Canada and Louisiana, like I said. So, you know, if you haven't met a Métis, that's unfortunate. But our community was all of La Kaede, so all of Nova Scotia. So you know, we've been here forever. You know, I'm from a small town in Cape Breton, Blaise Bay, and you know, I had Métis in my neighborhood.
Well, but if you've been there for a long time, how come people don't know of the Métis? Like, were you hiding? Were you just did you just blend it in with the rest of the people there? Because people say we don't know anything with these Métis who have been here all this time.
Yeah, we just come out of the closet because in the 1500s, when the first mixed marriage happened here, and we have all kinds of records in the 1600s and 1700s with the mixed marriages. The Jesuit priests named the children Métissage, and that's how they were referred to. And in all of the historian records, they're referred to either as Acadian Matey, or Métis.
We're going to get to that, a little bit about that in a bit. The word Métis and how it's a French word that means of mixed blood of some variety, any variety. It's not specific to
Métis,
this.
Yes.
But we'll get back to that. We have a bunch of callers who are waiting patiently online, so if we can go to them right now. My producer Beverly will tell us who we have here. We have Will Goodon from Ottawa calling. Hello, Will.
Hi, Melissa. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. Just listening to some of your guests today, and you know, there's some good comments there, and there's some concerning comments as well. But it's an interesting topic for sure.
And what do you make of it? What you hear? I mean, you're well familiar with it. Will is Métis himself. I know this name from my time in Brandon, Manitoba. Will, you've been involved in Métis everything for as long as you've probably been walking on this earth. What do you think of this? Where we're at with this? I don't know if can we even call it this East-West divide? I don't even know whatever we call it. People are going to be mad. So
there's a few things that I think that need to be talked about, and I just want to commend Jason for some of the things that he brought up in his discussion. So I just wanted to start with a couple of quick points here, and the first one being is that we're not Métis, we're not the Métis Nation, we're not Métis Nation citizens because we're mixed. In fact, I would argue that being mixed is not even a marker of being Métis, that we are Métis because we are descended from Métis ancestors. The Métis are a distinct people. We developed in Western Canada over centuries. Jason spoke very correctly about this, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People supports this idea of nationhood, of peoplehood. And it definitely doesn't say that blood makes a people, or a drop of blood makes a people. What makes a people is things like community, things like culture, language, food, music, dance, clothing. All these things are markers of a people. And the Métis Nation, thankfully has these things that have developed, like I said, over centuries. And now we can definitely point to things like the infinity flag that was flown by Cuthbert Grant, which I see in Nova Scotia. And I wonder how Cuthbert got over to Nova Scotia. It's very confusing to me. Things like the fiddle, things like the sash. And I have watched this phenomenon for a while. And I've talked to a couple of people, and the idea of community is an interesting one. There's no doubt there's Métis Nation communities throughout Western Canada, but what I see is actually there is a community developing, but it's a virtual community. It exists on Facebook, it exists on Twitter, it exists on social media, but I would, very much, and I have a lot of people and actual Indigenous people who live in those territories are saying they don't see any Métis communities, but it's now existing in virtual reality.
That's interesting. I like that's an interesting point to make. Well, we are going to have to let you go. We've got another person on the line. Thanks for taking the time to give us a shout. I appreciate that. Always good to hear from you. Now we have Kaede from North Dakota who's here with a question. Hello, Kaede.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Great. I guess I have a statement as also a question maybe that Daryl could speak to afterwards, but I'm looking at this, and the focus of Matey identity is to an affiliation with the traditional Métis homeland, historical and current Indigenous kinship with the Métis Nation, and community acceptance. It's not just having a distant ancestor. Without that kinship, community, culture, and homeland, it's illogical to claim to be Métis simply on blood. I think that the connection with the historic and modern Métis community needs to be established, and it doesn't matter if you declare yourself to be a chief, to start your own organization and say that you're representing Métis people, or just that you feel that Métis exists from coast to coast to coast, as Chief Burke said. But at the end of the day, you just aren't Métis without that. You need to have that community and that historical connection.
So, well, I'll leave this to you. Daryl?
Well, I'll just pick up, I guess, on that last point. One of the things that I've discovered doing this research, I have accessed over 5,000 individual genealogies that are used by organizations. So they basically presented them in court cases. And looking through those 5,000 genealogies, and these are genealogies of Eastern Métis organizations and individuals who are claiming that identity, 80% of those over 5,000, the individuals are relying on a woman in the 1600s as the basis for their Indigenous identity. And in many cases, and what I found actually is that 30% of those of the overall claims, the individual has no Indigenous ancestry. Because what happens is there's a bunch of French women, particularly in Nova Scotia and Acadia, who are turned into Indigenous women for the purpose of this movement. And this is stuff that they present in court as evidence of their existence, right? So even the three largest organizations in Quebec right now, I've seen their records, and 30% of their members have no Indigenous ancestry whatsoever. And they start as movements against Indigenous people's rights. That's actually the people who end up founding these organizations in 3 different regions in Quebec. They're actually founding white rights organizations and associations, and also sort of fomenting violence against Innu people and Mi'kmaq people in different regions.
I'm proclaiming to be Métis.
Afterwards, after Paoli.
But having no Indigenous ancestry whatsoever, never mind Métis ancestry.
In 30% of the cases
30% of the cases.
Yeah, and in the other cases, most people, we're not talking about a few generations away. We're talking about, on average, 9 generations away. But for most, it's actually 12 generations.
Wow.
I'm one of those people.
You're one of those people. So 12 generations back,
I have
you
Indigenous
can find
3 Algonquin ancestors in the 1600s who I'm related to 3 of their children who are born between 1664 and 1679.
3. So you've got more than a lot of what these people are claiming.
I have more than 75% of the members that I've seen.
So you're Métis by this definition?
I could join any of the organizations, yes.
And do you identify as Métis?
No, absolutely not.
What do you identify as?
I'm French Canadian. That's what I've grown up as. I hunt and I fish just like my family have, but in no way does that make me Indigenous. My family has maintained no connections, no relationships with actual Indigenous people, and often actually express animosity towards Indigenous peoples as white people.
Yeah.
And that's more or less what I've discovered in the research I've seen.
We got to take another break. It feels like we need to have 2 hours for this discussion. We got to go to a break, but we are not done hashing out what is or isn't Métis, who is or isn't Métis. Please stay with us. We are coming back. Hello, welcome back. In case you're just joining us, we are putting Métis identity in focus. There are numerous groups emerging in Quebec and the Maritimes saying that they are the original Métis and predate the Red River Métis cousins or brothers or sisters by hundreds of years. But established Métis groups on the prairies say no way. And as we've mentioned, the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs and the Métis National Council have drawn a line in the sand, signing a memorandum of understanding that says they reject these claims to the idea of Métis, Eastern Métis. We've been discussing what's at the root of this and what's at stake for all involved. Chantal Fiola is Métis and an assistant professor in urban and inner city studies at the University of Winnipeg. She teaches about this very topic, Métis identity. So our producer here, Beverly Andrews, caught up with her between classes to find out what it is that she teaches about who is and isn't Métis.
In addition to self-identifying as Métis, you need to be able to prove prove a connection to historic Métis communities, recognized historic Métis communities. So that's usually in a certain kind of geographic homeland. Also, contemporary acceptance by, again, recognized Métis. So that could take the form of MMF citizenship, MNO citizenship, and being distinct from other Indigenous nations. So not First Nation, not Inuit. This is a controversial and could be a very painful topic. When people say they're something and you tell them they're not, it feels like the rug's being pulled out from under them. But we can't lose sight of how this is impacting Métis nationhood and self-determination. You know, the part of the definition of nationhood and self-determination is that a group has the right to determine its own citizenship and lobby the government, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all getting confused because of non-Indigenous Canadians with the one ancestor 200 years ago saying that they should have a right to speak in Supreme Court cases that are affecting Métis people across the country. I would say that if you only have one ancestor from 200 years ago, it's inappropriate to call yourself Métis and to even try to find like justification or legitimize your claims to Métis nationhood. Folks like that these are non-Indigenous Canadians with an Indigenous ancestor.
We are still joined in studio by Daryl LaRue. He's a researcher at the center of this storm. And I'm wondering if Greg is still on Skype with us?
I am, yes.
Okay, good, Greg. We're going to take some callers right now. We have Jean-Paul from Bathurst, New Brunswick, who's on the line. Jean-Paul, how are you?
Good.
Good. What are you phoning in here for?
I just want to remind your guest there that I think he called himself a Mi'kmaq. But if you look in the Treaty of 1726, the ratification, you should know that. I think there were 72 chiefs that signed on that, and they were all Métis, all French names. Okay? And in that treaties, every Métis here in the East have been recognized by the British and by the Mi'kmaq themselves, because it's said on the treaty for their natural descendants. So it doesn't matter, and to back that up too, you can look at the Colonial Act of 1850. They say the same thing. Even if you're a Métis, you're considered an Indian. So that's just a game that the Mi'kmaq is playing right now, and the Métis in the West try to pretend that there's no Métis here. All Mi'kmaq here are Métis. I don't know why they don't understand that, or they don't want to go along with that. But I'm in court now with no lawyer for the last 8 years, and the government doesn't want to start the court right now. But believe me, I'm going to go to the end. And it cost me $20,000 of document to go in court. And I got all certified paper that I can prove that all Mi'kmaq in the East here are Métis.
And I see you have Greg is nodding in agreement with what you're saying there. I mean, Greg, so if you're saying that the Métis in fact do exist, it's been acknowledged. I mean, I guess I would ask, where were you guys when we were fighting out here? We could have used some backup.
Well, and I agree with you 150% on that. And I think a lot of it was a lack of leadership and a lack of organization. And going back to Terrence Paul, he said that he hadn't heard of any Métis in the Maritimes until a couple of years ago.
Well, I took over, I organized the Métis community in Ayrshad, St. Peter's, Point de Luce, and that area there. And when I started to come forward with the help of the MFC, who, by the way, are all Western Métis. Everybody on the board is Western Métis. It became more prevalent, and we were in the news. But I think a lot of it, and I agree with you, yes, in 1982, my brother and I followed the court case very closely back in '82, and yes, there should have been a leadership, and they should have been involved, and they should have been in court. But I just want to touch on John Paul. He jumped ahead of me here with the treaty. The treaty clearly states that we were recognized as Indian. Our ancestors did the negotiations for those treaties. Our names are all over them. That's why a lot of Mi'kmaq took our names, because we married into their families and they have English names. And at the end of it all, the treaty pretty well stipulates where we're defined.
Okay, I'm going to go to Daryl now. This is not my wheelhouse. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. Daryl, you've spent a lot of your professional life looking into this. I'm curious about your take on this treaty.
Well, I mean, this is repeated over and over again. First of all, to Greg Burke's claim that the first child born to a mixed-race marriage was called métissage. That didn't happen. There's no documents from 1604 that state that. Métissage did not mean what it later come to mean in the 1700s. In France at the time, métissage meant something completely different. So that doesn't make sense linguistically if you actually look at the basis of that term at that time in history. Second of all, this claim by Jean Paul that a distinct Métis people signed the treaty, right, is completely false. The people who are in the treaty are representatives of the Mi'kmaq. Some of them happen to be mixed race, right? Now what's happening is these folks who are claiming to be Acadian Matey are going back to those documents, pointing out that certain people are Métis, meaning mixed race, and that therefore they signed the treaties.
Okay, why can't they just go back at this word métissage? Why can't the Acadian Métis say, we are métissage? What Métis has come to mean to most of Canada is one thing. Why don't you start from the ground up and say, we are a different group that falls within under the umbrella of Indigenous. We don't like being called non-status. We don't like being called mixed blood. The Métis, as they are now, after the fights the Métis have said, we're not accepting you into our own. Why don't you start this other group? Why can't it be called métissage and start from the ground up and build your nation that way?
Well, first of all, I disagree that these folks are Indigenous for the most part, if they're claiming that a Mi'kmaq ancestor in the 1600s makes them Indigenous. As you heard, the Mi'kmaq do not recognize another Indigenous people in their territory.
Right.
Period. Yeah. Right? So if we're going to respect the right to self-determination that Indigenous peoples have, especially in this case where we're making claims that a people who the Mi'kmaq didn't even recognize then signed a treaty on behalf of the Mi'kmaq. That doesn't actually make a lot of sense, and this is another sort of way in which history is being revised. People who are mixed race in the past, if they're Mi'kmaq or if they're Algonquin, which are two cases that I've seen, they automatically all of a sudden become Métis and the basis for a distinct Métis people out east. When those people at the time identified themselves as Mi'kmaq or Algonquin and were identified by their own community that way.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not true. What Daryl LaRue is trying to spin here, when he said that the first baby born in 1601 wasn't called métissage, it never happened. Well, Naomi Griffiths is a well-known author who all her research is backed up by records, and she has written in one of her 14 books that, in fact, I know you're nodding your head, Daryl, but I listened to your lectures, and you don't. I'm really at awe here, as you don't know our history at all, but you want to speak about it, and I'm glad you agree with that, because at the end of the day, Naomi Griffiths is a professor at a retired professor at Carleton, well-known author. All of her books, if you read her 14 of her books, every one of them backed up by
by the wreckers from the French and from the British.
We are going to be getting cut off here pretty quickly. I wanted to say, too, Daryl, what I find fascinating about you is that this is your area of research. You don't have a dog in the fight. Greg had just said, you don't speak for us. I liked you as you weren't here with a dog in the fight. That is all the time we have for today. Always, we thank you for joining us to discuss these important issues on In Focus. This episode will be available for download as a podcast on our website at aptnnews.ca/podcast. And if you missed any of the shows and want to catch up, you can check out the website, aptnnews.ca. Thank you so much to all my guests for joining us today. I appreciate everybody's perspective as we discuss this.
Thanks.
Say goodbye to the dog.